I'm Asger. You can ask me anything. Today I'm answering this question from Danny Albee over on SoMe. How does someone endow inanimate matter with consciousness? So we're not talking about how to create artificial intelligence. We're talking about how to create artificial consciousness. Now, the first step in this is, of course, to agree on some definition of consciousness. So according to the freedictionary.com, consciousness can be defined as the state or condition of being conscious. So then we have to ask the question, what is conscious? They actually offer a pretty good definition of that. Characterized by or having an awareness of one's environment and one's own existence, sensations, and thoughts. So that's what we're going to use for the purpose of this video. So now we have this operational definition of what conscious means. We have to ask ourselves, obviously we all have a subjective experience of being conscious, but we have to ask, is Nina back there conscious? I mean, in some sense, does she have an awareness of her environment? Yes, she does, clearly. Does she know about her own existence? Is she aware of her sensations and thoughts? She doesn't really have a meta level, does she? But that doesn't mean that no other animals than humans do so. So, on my podcast, MetaQuest, I spoke to Gordon Gallup. He's the guy who invented the mirror test, where you can test whether and when animals, and humans for that matter, develop self-awareness. So it's probably fair to assume that at least a few other primates, such as chimpanzees, for instance, have what we would call a conscious experience. So the reason I'm talking about this is that we need somewhere to start. I don't want this video to be about what consciousness is and isn't. So the reason I spend all this time defining this concept really is that we need to start somewhere. And we see in the animal kingdom, even though it's only, ourselves and one or two other species, maybe a few others as well, that have what we could reasonably refer to as consciousness, we need to start somewhere. We don't have any computers, as far as we know, that exhibit consciousness. And even if they did, if they were able to pass the Turing test or something like that, that wouldn't mean that they are conscious. All it would mean is that they are able to fool us into thinking that. So my initial thoughts on this question was, okay, so we need to start somewhere. So how about this question? So if I could enter a machine that were able to copy every single atom of my body, create a clone, essentially, just like that, boom, then we have another Asger over here. Would that being be conscious? I don't have any reason to believe that that being would not be conscious. So, on that basis, it seems reasonable to assume that a certain configuration of atoms and molecules leads to consciousness. But an obvious issue is that the tiniest of modifications to this organism, to this copy of me, would remove its consciousness completely. If we just removed half its brain, it wouldn't be able to function. And even if we just removed all the neurotransmitter receptors in its brain, it wouldn't feel anything. Without feelings, would that then constitute consciousness? I'm not so sure about that, actually. There's one more important thing we need to just touch on briefly before we can answer the question, and that is, consciousness doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is just my personal opinion. If we could take your consciousness, or even just your brain, put it in a vat, send it out into space, send it into nothingness, if there is nothing to be conscious of or aware of, would it even be possible to be conscious? I actually don't think so. And I think this is a really important point to make here, that if nothing existed around me right now, including my own body, there would be no light and darkness, there would be no up and down, there would just be nothing to be conscious of. So, an important part of being conscious is, as the definition stated as well, an awareness of the environment. But that environment also includes the physical bodies we have. If we really want to create an artificial consciousness out of inanimate matter, it probably needs some physical characteristics that resemble those that we have, or at the very least, that other animals, such as Nina here in the background, has. So of course, an obvious place to start is to, okay, so if we could just study a human brain in absolute minute detail, know everything about how it works and how the different areas of that brain work and how those areas or regions communicate with each other, then we should be able to reproduce it in a computer, right? And we can then take this computer and put it in some, a doll, I guess, a puppet that looks like a human body. That might solve the issue of the sensory perceptions that is clearly needed for a human-like consciousness to be brought into existence. But there are some serious issues with that. First of all, there's the computational issue. Some people say that the human brain is beyond the universe, it is the most complex entity that exists. But let's just say that, okay, so a couple decades from now, we all have quantum computers, and they're able to not just make these observations of the brain that we need, but also to copy them in real time. That could maybe be done. But would that computer be conscious? I actually don't think so. And let me explain why I don't think that's possible. Some of you may have heard that smell is a quantum phenomenon. I remember seeing this debate with Seth Lloyd and a few other people. So Seth Lloyd describes how he has this acquaintance who's not a scientist per se, but to him, all he does is he tries to create the most pleasing smells possible. So smells are essentially a molecule that is picked up by a very specific receptor that's inside your brain. But here's a fun fact. We only have 300 of these receptors in our bodies, but we can distinguish between more than 10,000 different smells. So there's something that we don't know, or at least used to not know, about how smells work. So here's a clue. So in this talk with Seth Lloyd, he mentions that this acquaintance of him, he tries to create a copy of a rose smell. So he essentially just takes this molecule that the rose flower bud sends out, and he makes a copy of it. And the only difference between the actual rose smell molecule and the artificial one is that he, instead of using a carbon atom, he uses a silicon atom. And they have very similar properties. You can't really say they're identical per se, but the main difference is, so they have the same number of electrons in the outer shell, but the carbon atom and the silicon atom don't have the same weight, which also means that they don't have the same vibration. And this is not rude in any sense. This is really just describing the physical properties. And when this acquaintance of Seth Lloyd asked people to smell these artificial rosebud molecules, it smelled like shit. Literally. So that's really a clue as to some of the other things that we have to include. Now, this is just smells, right? But if you think about it, if such a tiny little change in one tiny molecule that's picked up by one tiny receptor out of hundreds, if that changes the experience significantly, then how would it change the experience for a being quote unquote who has no receptors at all? I don't think that being would be conscious in any reasonable sense of that word. And this is just for smells. Now, if we look at neurotransmitters, I don't know anything about whether neurotransmitters react in similar manners if we compare the organic, normal neurotransmitters that our bodies produce all the time against artificial neurotransmitter drugs, I guess. I suspect there are some differences there. But again, just imagine how you would feel without feelings. If you didn't have any emotions, you could smell anything. I bring this up because it sheds some light on the issues that we need to solve before we can even hope to begin to develop an artificial consciousness. So to be completely honest with you, I actually don't think this is possible. Now, we could, of course, these are just wild speculations, right? But many of you have probably heard of this U.S. company called Memphis Meats, who try to grow lab meat, so to speak. They just take a tiny little DNA sample of some cow or a chicken or something like that. They're able to grow meat artificially in the lab. Now, of course, we could clone people and grow artificial human beings or something like that. I mean, would they even be artificial? If they're human beings, they're human beings, and it would probably be very, very unethical to grow them in a lab just for the sake of some experiment. And again, we wouldn't really succeed in creating an artificial consciousness. We would just succeed in creating a copy of a human being. I mean, and these receptors are really just an example of how intertwined everything is in a biological organism. So honestly, I actually don't think that it's possible to create artificial consciousness for all these reasons. I mean, if we take a conscious human being and just make tiny little changes, I mean, remove a tiny little part of their brain or just a few receptors, we're going to have a completely different experience. And at some point, not very far down the road of removing little parts of this human being, the person will probably stop being conscious. But let me offer you something else that I really think we should do. Now, some animals, as I already mentioned, pass the mirror test. Some animals may have been able to pass the mirror test in the past, but no longer do so. I learned this from one of my interviews with Gordon Gallup. What we really should do is we should find the specimens of other species, such as the crows in the background here, and we should take the ones that exhibit the most self-aware behavior, and then we should breed them with each other. I actually think that it's, at least in theory, it could be possible to breed certain other animal species, always just selecting for the ones that exhibit the highest degree of self-awareness. We could actually ultimately probably end up having colonies of crows or ravens or dolphins or chimpanzees who may not be I mean, they'll never be human, of course, but they could be so self-aware that in a sense they might ultimately be as conscious as we are. I think that's the only way to go about it. So to answer the question, just to sum up here, no, unfortunately, I don't think it is possible to create something that we would accept as conscious from inanimate matter. And that's not because I think, this specific constellation of atoms and molecules is magical in any sense, as most of you will know, having watched some of my previous videos. But it appears that the constellation needs to be very, very exact. It needs to really not diverge very much. I mean, it can almost hardly diverge from a very specific blueprint before consciousness disappears altogether. And that's sort of almost regardless of what kind of definition you have of consciousness. I hope this was entertaining to you. I hope it was useful. I mean, I would love to hear if I failed in my endeavor to answer this question. And please ask your questions below. I'm Asger. You can ask me anything. And please subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost you anything. It has value to me. And if you enjoyed this video, why not give it a like? And I'll see you tomorrow in the next one. Thanks for listening. Have a good one. Cheers.